Hey there, fellow sapiens, and welcome back to another journey through deep time. Tonight we're diving into one of the most haunting chapters in our species' story. One that began not with conquest or war, but with footprints. Human footprints crossing into new worlds. And behind us, silence. The kind of silence that follows when giants disappear forever. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video if you find these stories as fascinating as I do, and consider subscribing if you enjoy thoughtful explorations of our shared past. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now imagine this. You're standing in a landscape that no longer exists. It's roughly 12,000 years ago, and you're somewhere in what we now call North America. But this isn't the America you know. This is a world of giants, massive ground sloths the size of small cars, lumber through forests that stretch beyond horizons. Saber-toothed cats with fangs like curved daggers stalk through tall grass. Mammoths, their tusks gleaming in the afternoon sun. Trumpet calls that echo across valleys filled with creatures so enormous they seem pulled from myth. And then, over the span of just a few thousand years, they're gone. Not just reduced in number, gone, extinct, vanished so completely that we know them now only through bones buried in museum drawers and reconstructions that can never quite capture the weight of their presence. This is the story of the Megafauna Extinction, and it's not a comfortable one, because the more we learn about what happened to these giants, the more it becomes clear that we, Homo sapiens, weren't just errants. We were the witnesses to their disapped cause. But here's what makes this story even more unsettling. It didn't happen once. It happened over and over again, on every continent we reached, in a pattern so consistent it's impossible to ignore. Australia, 45,000 years ago. Europe, 30,000 years ago. The Americas, 12,000 years ago. Madagascar, just over 1,000 years ago. Each time humans arrived somewhere new, the large animals began to vanish. Tonight, we're going to walk through this pattern, piece by piece, continent by continent. We'll explore the evidence that's been building for decades, the debates that still rage among scientists, and the uncomfortable truth about what it means to be human in a world where giants once walked. The term megafauna literally means large animals, but that doesn't quite capture what we're talking about. These weren't just big animals. These were creatures that defined entire ecosystems. In scientific terms, megafauna typically refers to animals weighing over 45 kilograms, or about 100 pounds. But many of the animals we'll discuss tonight were far, far larger. Think of the Irish elk with antlers spanning 12 feet, the cave bear standing 11 feet tall on its hind legs, giant beavers the size of black bears, short-faced bears that could run down horses, terror birds with beaks that could crack skulls. These weren't just large versions of animals we know today. Many were entirely different kinds of creatures, filling ecological niches that simply don't exist anymore. What's remarkable is how recently this happened. When we talk about extinction, we often think of dinosaurs vanishing 65 million years ago. But the megafauna extinction is practically yesterday in geological terms. Many of these animals were alive when the pyramids were being built. Some survived until humans had developed writing, agriculture, and complex societies. The timing matters because it helps us understand the cause. For millions of years, these giants had survived ice ages, climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, and every other natural catastrophe the planet could throw at them. They were tough, adaptable, successful, and then humans showed up, and within a few thousand years, they were gone. Now, before we go further, let's address the elephant in the room. And yes, I'm aware of the irony of that phrase given what we're discussing. The idea that humans caused the megafauna extinction is controversial, even among scientists. There are researchers who argue that climate change was the primary driver, that the end of the last ice age created conditions these animals couldn't survive, and they have a point. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from about 2.6 million years ago, until roughly 11,700 years ago, was ending just as humans were spreading across the globe. Glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, and ecosystems were changing rapidly. It's entirely possible that these environmental shifts would have caused extinctions regardless of human involvement. But here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Climate change was a global phenomenon, but the extinctions weren't random. They followed human migration routes with eerie precision. And when we look at islands that humans reached much later, we see the same story playing out in miniature, compressed into even shorter time frames. Take New Zealand, for instance. Humans didn't arrive there until around 1280 CE, making it one of the last places on Earth to be colonised by our species. When the Maori arrived, they found a land dominated by moa, flightless birds that stood up to 12 feet tall. Within 300 years, all 9 species of moa were extinct. 300 years. That's faster than the time between the American Revolution and today. Or consider Madagascar, where humans arrived sometime between 2,000 and 1,500 years ago. The island was home to elephant birds that laid eggs the size of footballs, giant lemurs and hippos. By the time European explorers reached Madagascar in the 1500s, most of these giants were already gone. The pattern is so consistent that paleontologists have a name for it: the Blitzkrieg hypothesis. The idea is that when humans entered new environments, especially those where large animals had no experience with human predators, the result was swift and devastating. Not necessarily because we hunted everything to extinction directly, though that certainly happened, but because our presence disrupted ecosystems in ways that large animals couldn't adapt to quickly enough. We brought fire, using it to alter landscapes on a massive scale. We competed for resources, taking the best hunting grounds and water sources. We introduced diseases, both directly and through the animals we brought with us. We were, in essence, an invasive species unlike anything the world had ever seen. But let's start at the beginning of this story, with the first great disappearance. Australia, roughly 45,000 years ago, when the first humans crossed the water from Southeast Asia and encountered a land of giants, unlike anywhere else on Earth. When the first Aboriginal Australians arrived on their continent, they found themselves in what can only be described as a real-life land of monsters. This wasn't hyperbole. Australia's Pleistocene megafauna included some of the most bizarre and terrifying creatures ever to walk the Earth. There was Megalania, a monitor lizard that grew up to 23 feet long and weighed as much as a small car. Its bite was venomous, and it was perfectly capable of taking down prey much larger than itself. Imagine encountering that while searching for water in the Australian outback. Then there was Diprotodon, often called the giant wombat, though that comparison doesn't do it justice. This creature was the size of a small rhino, weighing up to 4 tons, with massive claws for digging and a skull built like a battering ram. It was herbivorous, but anything that size doesn't need to be aggressive to be dangerous. The skies were dominated by Haast's eagle, though that was actually in New Zealand. In Australia, the terror came in the form of enormous flightless birds called dromornithids, some standing over 10 feet tall with beaks designed for crushing. These weren't birds you'd want to meet in a dark alley, or anywhere else for that matter, but perhaps the most unsettling of all was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. This wasn't actually related to true lions, but it filled a similar ecological niche. It had massive forepaws with retractable claws, bolt cutters for teeth, and a bite force that exceeded that of any living predator. It was perfectly adapted for ambush hunting, and recent research suggests it may have been one of the most efficient killers ever to evolve. When humans arrived in Australia, they entered this ecosystem as just another medium-sized mammal. But they brought something none of these giants had ever encountered: systematic hunting strategies, tools, fire, and most importantly, the ability to cooperate in ways that could take down prey many times their size. The evidence for human impact in Australia is compelling but complex. We find archaeological sites with the bones of megafauna that show clear signs of human modification. Cut marks from stone tools, evidence of controlled burning that altered entire landscapes, patterns of extinction that correlate closely with human arrival times. But we also find something else. Evidence that these early Australians didn't just hunt the megafauna to extinction. They lived alongside them for thousands of years. Rock art depicting giant kangaroos and other megafauna suggests that these animals were part of Aboriginal culture, part of their stories and spiritual beliefs. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of extinction. It's easy to imagine early humans as ruthless hunters, systematically wiping out every large animal they encountered. But the reality appears to be more complex. The extinction of Australia's megafauna took place over several thousand years, suggesting a gradual process rather than a sudden slaughter. What likely happened was a combination of direct hunting pressure and indirect effects. Humans altered the landscape through controlled burning, changing plant communities in ways that favoured some species over others. They competed for water sources and shelter sites. They may have introduced diseases or parasites. And gradually, over generations, the populations of large animals declined until they reached a point from which they couldn't recover. This pattern, complex and gradual rather than sudden and violent, would repeat itself across the globe as humans continued their expansion into new worlds. But Australia was just the beginning. The next great chapter in this story would unfold in Europe, where humans encountered an entirely different set of giants in landscapes carved by ice. The European extinction story is different from Australia's, more drawn out and complex, partly because humans had been in Europe for much longer. We weren't arriving as complete strangers to these ecosystems. Neanderthals had been living alongside European megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. But when modern humans, our direct ancestors, began moving into Europe around 45,000 years ago, something changed in the balance. Europe during the Late Pleistocene was a landscape of extremes. Massive ice sheets covered much of the northern continent, but the areas that remained habitable were incredibly rich in wildlife. This was the world of cave paintings, where early humans documented their encounters with creatures that seem almost mythical to us now. The woolly mammoth is probably the most famous of Europe's Ice Age giants, and for good reason. These weren't just large elephants with fur coats. They were perfectly adapted Arctic specialists, with curved tusks that could sweep snow away from vegetation. Thick layers of fat and fur that insulated them against temperatures that would kill modern elephants, and complex social structures that helped them survive in harsh environments. But mammoths weren't alone. The European steppes were home to woolly rhinoceros, massive creatures with thick fur and forward-pointing horns designed for sweeping snow. Cave bears hibernated in the same caves that humans used for shelter, leading to conflicts that are documented in both archaeological evidence and ancient art. Then there were the predators, cave lions that were larger than any lions alive today, with males that may have weighed over 700 pounds, short-faced bears that stood 13 feet tall on their hind legs, and perhaps most impressive of all, the cave hyena, which wasn't actually closely related to modern hyenas, but was one of the most successful predators of Ice Age Europe. What makes the European extinction particularly fascinating is that we have more evidence for the interactions between humans and these animals. Cave paintings from sites like Lascaux and Chauvet show detailed depictions of mammoths, rhinoceros, and cave lions. These weren't just random doodles, they were sophisticated artistic representations that suggest deep familiarity with these animals' behaviour and anatomy. We also have evidence of hunting, mammoth bone huts in Eastern Europe, where early humans used the bones of these giants to construct elaborate shelters. Spear points, embedded in mammoth ribs, sites where entire herds appear to have been driven over cliffs or into bogs where they could be more easily killed. But here's where the European story gets complicated. These extinctions didn't happen all at once. The cave bear disappeared around 24,000 years ago. The woolly rhinoceros vanished around 14,000 years ago. Mammoths held on in most of Europe until about 12,000 years ago, though isolated populations survived much longer on remote islands. This staggered timeline has led some researchers to argue that climate change, not humans, was the primary driver of European megafauna extinction. The argument goes like this. As the Ice Age ended and forests spread across the continent, the open grasslands that supported these large herbivores disappeared. Without their preferred habitat, the animals couldn't survive, regardless of human hunting pressure. It's a compelling argument, and there's definitely truth to it. Climate change was reshaping European ecosystems in dramatic ways. But there are problems with the climate-only hypothesis. Many of these animals had survived previous periods of climate change. They'd lived through multiple Ice Age cycles, adapting to warming and cooling periods that were just as dramatic as the one at the end of the Pleistocene. What was different this time was the presence of increasingly sophisticated human hunters. By 20,000 years ago, European humans had developed complex hunting technologies. They had atlatls, spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy over long distances. They had sophisticated knowledge of animal behaviour, allowing them to predict migration routes and seasonal movements. They had coordinated hunting strategies that could take down even the largest prey. Perhaps most importantly, they had reached a population density where their impact on ecosystems became significant. This wasn't just a few scattered bands of hunter-gatherers anymore. By the end of the Ice Age, humans were established across most of Europe, competing with megafauna for resources and space. The archaeological evidence suggests that the relationship between humans and European megafauna was complex and varied. Some sites show clear evidence of intensive hunting, with massive bone accumulations that represent specialised megafauna processing areas. Others show more opportunistic exploitation, where humans took advantage of animals that died from other causes, but there's also evidence of something more troubling: overkill sites where the remains of multiple animals show signs of butchering, but much of the meat appears to have been wasted. This suggests that in some cases humans were killing more than they could use, possibly for reasons beyond simple subsistence. Why would early humans overkill? There are several possibilities. Competition between groups might have led to wasteful hunting practices, where the goal was to deny resources to rivals rather than to feed your own group. Ritual or ceremonial reasons might have driven some hunting, or it might have been simple opportunism, taking advantage of situations where large numbers of animals could be killed easily, even if all the meat couldn't be processed. Whatever the reasons, the pattern is clear. As human populations grew and their hunting technologies improved, Europe's megafauna began to disappear, and unlike in Australia, where the process took many thousands of years, the European extinctions accelerated toward the end of the Ice Age, suggesting that human impact was intensifying over time. But Europe was still just the second act in this global drama. The most dramatic and well-documented chapter was yet to come, when humans finally crossed into the Americas and encountered the richest megafauna community on Earth. What happened there would be faster, more devastating, and more clearly linked to human arrival than anything that had come before. The story of megafauna extinction in the Americas is perhaps the most dramatic and heartbreaking chapter in this global tragedy. When humans first crossed the Bering Land Bridge sometime around 15,000 years ago, they entered what can only be described as an ecological paradise. The Americas were home to more species of megafauna than anywhere else on Earth, and many of them were completely unprepared for what was coming. This was a world where giant ground sloths the size of elephants browsed in forests from Alaska to Argentina, where American cheetahs, faster than their African cousins, pursued pronghorns across endless plains, where saber-toothed cats with 6-inch fangs ambushed prey at waterholes, and short-faced bears that could outrun horses dominated the landscape as apex predators. The scale of what existed in the Americas is almost impossible to comprehend. There were 4 different species of mammoth, from the familiar woolly mammoth in the north to the massive Columbian mammoth that roamed the southern plains. There were mastodons different from mammoths, with straighter tusks and teeth designed for browsing in forests. There were giant beavers the size of modern bears, building dams that could alter entire river systems. But perhaps most impressive of all were the ground sloths. These weren't the small, slow-moving creatures we know today. Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, stood 20 feet tall on its hind legs and weighed as much as an elephant. It had massive claws that could strip bark from trees or defend against the largest predators. Some species lived in caves, others in open grasslands, and a few were even semi-aquatic. The diversity was staggering. North America alone was home to over 150 species of megafauna, from tiny horses no bigger than dogs to massive dire wolves with bone-crushing jaws. South America had its own unique assemblage, including giant armadillos the size of cars and terror birds that stood 10 feet tall and could run down prey with devastating efficiency. And then, in what amounts to an evolutionary instant, most of them were gone. By 10,000 years ago, roughly 80% of North America's megafauna species had vanished. In South America, the percentage was even higher. This wasn't a gradual decline over millions of years. This was ecological collapse in fast forward, compressed into just a few thousand years. The timing is impossible to ignore. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans spread rapidly throughout the Americas once they crossed the ice-free corridor between the massive glaciers that covered much of North America. Within perhaps as little as 1,000 years, human populations had reached the southern tip of South America, a distance of over 10,000 miles. This rapid expansion coincides almost exactly with the wave of extinctions. In fact, the correlation is so precise that some researchers have proposed that the two are causally linked in a very direct way. The idea, known as the Blitzkrieg hypothesis, suggests that as human populations moved south, they encountered naive prey animals that had no evolutionary experience with human predators. The result, according to this hypothesis, was a feeding frenzy. Animals that showed no fear of humans, that didn't run when approached by these strange bipedal creatures with sharp sticks, were easy targets. Entire herds could be slaughtered with minimal effort. And because the animals had no learned behaviours to protect them from human hunters, they couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. The evidence supporting this hypothesis is substantial. Archaeological sites throughout the Americas contain the bones of megafauna species with clear signs of human modification. Cut marks from stone tools, spear points embedded in bones, processing sites where large numbers of animals were butchered and their remains discarded. One of the most famous examples is the Blackwater Draw site in New Mexico, where archaeologists found the remains of multiple mammoth kills dating to around 11,000 years ago. The bones show clear evidence of systematic butchering, with cut marks in all the right places to efficiently remove meat and break down the carcass. But it wasn't just opportunistic hunting. There's evidence of specialised megafauna hunting technologies. Clovis points, the distinctive spear heads found throughout North America, were clearly designed for taking down large prey. They're big, robust, and perfectly balanced for penetrating thick hide and reaching vital organs. More dramatically, there are sites that suggest coordinated hunting strategies that could take down entire herds. At the Waco Mammoth site in Texas, the remains of a nursery herd of Columbian mammoths suggest that humans may have targeted family groups, killing adults and juveniles together in what must have been a coordinated attack. The impact wasn't limited to direct hunting. Humans brought fire, and they used it liberally. Evidence from across the Americas shows a dramatic increase in fire frequency coinciding with human arrival. This wasn't just the occasional wildfire. This was systematic landscape modification on a continental scale. The effects on megafauna would have been devastating. Many of the largest herbivores depended on specific plant communities that fire could destroy. Grasslands that supported mammoths and bison could be converted to forests through fire suppression, while forests that supported browsing animals, like ground sloths, could be opened up through controlled burning. Human-set fires also created ecological traps. Animals fleeing fires would concentrate in unburned areas, making them easier targets for hunters. Some sites suggest that humans deliberately used fire to drive animals into bogs, rivers, or cliffs where they could be killed more easily. But perhaps the most insidious effect was indirect competition. Humans were incredibly efficient at exploiting resources. They could process plant foods that large herbivores couldn't access, extract nutrients from environments that seemed barren, and most importantly, they could store food for lean periods. This efficiency meant that human populations could grow rapidly in new environments, quickly reaching densities where they began to compete directly with native species for resources. Water sources, the best foraging areas, seasonal migration routes, all of these became contested spaces where humans had significant advantages. The result was a perfect storm of pressures that converged on American megafauna in ways they'd never experienced before. Direct hunting pressure from sophisticated predators, habitat modification through fire, competition for resources, and unlike in other continents where these pressures had built up gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, in the Americas they all arrived at once, carried by a single invasive species that was unlike anything the ecosystem had ever seen. The speed of this collapse becomes even more staggering when you realise that many of these animals had survived multiple ice age cycles. The giant ground sloths had weathered climate changes that lasted tens of thousands of years. The saber-toothed cats had adapted to shifting prey bases and changing environments over millions of years of evolution. These weren't fragile species living on the edge of extinction. They were successful, adaptable creatures that had proven their resilience time and again. And yet, within just a few millennia of human arrival, they were gone. What makes this even more remarkable is that we can actually trace the wave of extinction as it moved across the landscape. In Alaska and northern Canada, where humans arrived first, the extinctions began around 13,000 years ago. Moving south through the Great Plains, the timeline shifts to around 12,000 years ago. In Mexico and Central America, it's closer to 11,000 years ago. And in South America, the last of the megafauna disappeared between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. This isn't a random pattern. It's a chronological wave that follows human migration routes with disturbing precision. And when we look at the details, the story becomes even more compelling. Consider the horses. Yes, horses were native to North America. In fact, they evolved here, diversifying into dozens of species over millions of years. There were tiny horses the size of dogs, massive draft horse-sized species, and everything in between. Some lived in forests, others on open plains. Some had stripes like zebras, others were solid-coloured. When humans arrived, all of them vanished. Every single species of Native American horse went extinct, leaving behind only the occasional fossil to remind us they ever existed. It would be thousands of years before horses returned to the Americas, brought by European colonists who had no idea they were reintroducing animals to their ancestral homeland. The same story played out with camels. North America was home to several species of camel, including llama-like forms and giant long-legged species that stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder. They'd been successful for millions of years, spreading from North America to Asia and Africa, where their descendants still survive today. But in their homeland, they vanished completely. Giant beavers the size of modern black bears had been engineering North American waterways for millions of years. Their massive teeth could fell trees 2 feet in diameter, and their dams created wetland systems that supported countless other species. They survived ice ages, droughts, floods, and volcanic eruptions, but they couldn't survive humans. The cave bear story is particularly heartbreaking because we have such detailed evidence of the final chapters. These massive bears, larger than modern grizzlies, had shared cave systems with early humans for thousands of years. We find their remains mixed with human artifacts, suggesting a complex relationship that wasn't purely predatory. But as human populations grew and their technologies improved, competition for cave sites intensified. Bears needed caves for hibernation, spending months in deep sleep when they were completely vulnerable. Humans wanted the same caves for shelter, especially during harsh winters. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans began systematically clearing bears from cave systems, either killing hibernating animals or preventing them from accessing traditional denning sites. The result was predictable. Without access to safe hibernation sites, bear populations collapsed. The last cave bears died out around 24,000 years ago in Europe, but their American cousins, the giant short-faced bears, held on until humans crossed the Bering land bridge. Within 2,000 years of human arrival in North America, they too were extinct. But perhaps the most tragic story of all involves the giant ground sloths. These incredible creatures had successfully colonized environments from Arctic Alaska to tropical South America. They'd adapted to life in caves, forests, grasslands, and even semi-aquatic habitats. Some species lived in trees, others were specialized diggers, and a few had even developed armor-like skin to protect against predators. Recent research has revealed just how remarkable these animals were. They had complex social structures, with evidence suggesting that some species cared for their young for extended periods. They were ecosystem engineers, dispersing seeds and maintaining plant communities across vast areas. Some species had even developed a form of agriculture, cultivating specific plants in areas around their cave dwellings. And yet, every single species of ground sloth in North and South America went extinct shortly after human arrival. The last one survived on Caribbean islands until around 4,000 years ago, finally disappearing when humans reached these last refuges. The scale of this loss is almost incomprehensible. We're not just talking about the extinction of individual species, but the collapse of entire ecological communities that had existed for millions of years. Food webs that had been stable since the Miocene epoch unraveled in a matter of centuries. The effects cascaded through ecosystems in ways we're only beginning to understand. When the giant herbivores disappeared, plant communities changed dramatically. Grasslands that had been maintained by mammoth and bison grazing were invaded by forests. Seeds that had been dispersed by ground sloths and other large animals accumulated beneath parent trees, unable to colonize new areas. Predator populations crashed as their prey base disappeared. The massive short-faced bears couldn't survive on small mammals alone. Saber-toothed cats, specialized for taking down megafauna, found themselves without suitable prey. Even smaller predators felt the effects as competition intensified for the remaining resources. But the most haunting aspect of the American megafauna extinction isn't just what we lost, but how quickly we lost it. Archaeological evidence suggests that some species went from abundant to extinct in just a few hundred years. Imagine if elephants, rhinos, and hippos all disappeared from Africa within the span of 10 human generations. That's the scale of what happened in the Americas. And unlike the gradual extinctions in Australia or Europe, where at least some evidence suggests that humans and megafauna coexisted for extended periods, the American extinctions appear to have been swift and final. There are very few archaeological sites that show evidence of sustained coexistence between humans and megafauna. Most sites either predate human arrival or postdate the extinctions. This suggests that the American megafauna never had a chance to adapt to human presence. In other parts of the world, large animals had hundreds of thousands of years to evolve behavioral adaptations that helped them survive alongside increasingly sophisticated human hunters. African elephants learned to be wary of humans. Asian rhinos developed defensive behaviours. European deer became more elusive. But American megafauna encountered fully modern humans with sophisticated hunting technologies and no opportunity for gradual adaptation. It was ecological culture shock on a continental scale, and the native animals simply couldn't adjust fast enough to survive. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that many of these extinctions were probably unnecessary. Early human populations in the Americas were small, numbering in the thousands rather than millions. There was more than enough space and resources for both humans and megafauna to coexist. But the hunting technologies were so effective and the animals so naive that sustainable coexistence may never have been possible. Recent computer models have attempted to simulate what might have happened under different scenarios. Even with very conservative hunting rates, most models predict rapid megafauna extinction once humans arrive in the Americas. The animals were simply too vulnerable and human hunting efficiency too high for any other outcome. This modelling work has profound implications for our understanding of human impact on ecosystems. It suggests that even small human populations, armed with relatively simple technologies, can cause massive ecological disruptions if they encounter naive prey species. The lesson is sobering. We've been a force of extinction for far longer than most people realise. But the American story, devastating as it is, still wasn't the end. There were other islands, other continents, other populations of megafauna that would encounter humans for the first time in the millennia that followed. And in every case, the pattern would repeat itself with disturbing consistency. Madagascar, New Zealand, countless Pacific islands, all would see their giants disappear shortly after the first human footprints appeared on their shores. The question that haunts researchers studying these extinctions isn't whether humans caused them, but why the pattern was so consistent, so predictable, so seemingly inevitable. What is it about our species that makes us such efficient eliminators of large animals? And perhaps more importantly, what does this pattern tell us about our ongoing relationship with the natural world? Because the megafauna extinction isn't ancient history. It's still happening. And understanding how we wiped out the giants of the past might be the key to preventing the same fate from befalling the giants that remain. The pattern that emerged from the Americas would repeat itself with clockwork precision on islands across the globe. But nowhere was it more swift or devastating than on Madagascar, the world's fourth largest island, sitting in the Indian Ocean off the coast of East Africa like a forgotten piece of an ancient continent. When the first humans arrived in Madagascar sometime between 2000 and 1500 years ago, they found an evolutionary wonderland that had been developing in isolation for over 160 million years. This wasn't just another tropical island. This was a laboratory of evolution where creatures had grown to extraordinary sizes and developed behaviours found nowhere else on Earth. The island was dominated by elephant birds, the largest birds that ever lived. Aepyornis maximus stood nearly 10 feet tall and weighed over 1,000 pounds. Their eggs were the size of footballs, holding over 2 gallons of liquid. These weren't flying birds, they were walking fortresses, perfectly adapted to life without large mammalian predators. But the elephant birds weren't alone in their enormity. Madagascar was home to giant tortoises that weighed as much as grizzly bears, their shells serving as mobile fortresses as they lumbered through forests that no longer exist. There were massive crocodiles over 20 feet long, lurking in rivers that flowed through landscapes dotted with creatures that seemed pulled from mythology. Perhaps most remarkable of all were the giant lemurs. Today, the largest lemur weighs about 20 pounds, but Madagascar's forests once echoed with the calls of lemurs the size of gorillas. Archaeoindris, the largest of them all, weighed over 400 pounds and moved through the trees with surprising grace for something so massive. There were lemurs that hung from branches like giant sloths, others that walked upright across the ground, and some that lived semi-aquatic lives in the island's rivers and lakes. The hippos were another story entirely. Madagascar's hippos were smaller than their African cousins, but perfectly adapted to island life. They'd evolved into multiple species, some spending most of their time in water, others venturing far inland to graze in highland meadows. They were the gardeners of Madagascar's ecosystems, their grazing and wallowing creating the conditions that countless other species depended on. What made Madagascar's megafauna particularly vulnerable was their evolutionary naivety. For millions of years, the largest predators on the island had been relatively small. The biggest was the fossa, a cat-like carnivore that weighed perhaps 20 pounds. Nothing in Madagascar's evolutionary history had prepared its animals for creatures that could coordinate attacks, use tools, and think strategically about hunting. When humans finally arrived, likely travelling from Southeast Asia in outrigger canoes, they encountered animals that showed no fear. Elephant birds that had never needed to run from anything approached these strange new creatures with curiosity rather than caution. Giant lemurs that had spent millions of years as the lords of the forest canopy had no behavioural repertoire for dealing with bipedal predators who could throw spears and set fires. The archaeological evidence from Madagascar is both fascinating and heartbreaking. Cut marks on elephant bird bones show that humans quickly learned how to butcher these giants efficiently. Eggshell fragments found in cooking hearths suggest that the enormous eggs became a regular part of the human diet, and the timing of the extinctions tells the familiar story. Within a few centuries of human arrival, the giants began to disappear. But Madagascar offers us something unique in the extinction record: direct evidence of the final moments. At several sites, archaeologists have found elephant bird bones with stone tools still embedded in them, as if the hunters had abandoned their work mid-butchering. At others, they've discovered what appear to be elephant bird corrals, stone enclosures where these massive birds may have been kept alive until needed for food. The speed of the collapse was extraordinary, even by Megafauna Extinction standards. Computer models suggest that elephant birds went from abundant to extinct in less than 200 years. For a species that had survived for millions of years, had weathered climate changes and natural disasters, had successfully colonized an entire continent-sized island, 2 centuries was barely a blink of an eye. The cascade effects were immediate and devastating. When the elephant birds disappeared, the trees that depended on them for seed dispersal began to decline. These massive birds had been living seed distribution networks, carrying fruits in their guts for miles before depositing them in new locations. Without this service, Madagascar's forests began to fragment and shrink. The giant lemurs faced a different but equally insurmountable challenge. As human populations grew, they began clearing forests for agriculture, particularly the highland areas where many of the largest lemur species lived. These animals had evolved in continuous forest canopies, moving from tree to tree without ever needing to cross open ground. When the forests became fragmented, the giant lemurs found themselves trapped in increasingly small patches of habitat. The final blow came from hunting pressure and habitat destruction working in combination. Archaeological sites show that humans were systematically hunting lemurs of all sizes, from the massive Archaeoindris down to species no larger than modern lemurs. Cut marks on bones, burnt remains in cooking hearths, and tools made from lemur bones all tell the same story of intensive exploitation. By the time European explorers reached Madagascar in the 1500s, the age of giants was already over. The Portuguese sailors who first mapped the island's coasts wrote of seeing large birds in the interior, but these may have been the last scattered populations of elephant birds clinging to existence in remote areas. By 1700, even these reports had ceased. What survived were the legends. Malagasy oral traditions speak of vorombe, giant birds that could carry off cattle. They tell of kalanoro, forest spirits that were almost certainly based on memories of giant lemurs. Arab traders who visited Madagascar before the Europeans wrote of rook birds so large they could block out the sun with their wings. descriptions that may have been exaggerated accounts of elephant birds. But legends and stories are poor substitutes for living ecosystems. Madagascar today is home to remarkable wildlife, including dozens of lemur species found nowhere else on Earth. But it's a diminished world, missing the giants that once shaped its forests and grasslands. The island's ecosystems are still recovering from extinctions that happened over a millennium ago, and many may never fully recover. The Madagascar extinctions are particularly significant because they happened so recently and so quickly that we can trace their effects through human history. When Arab traders first began visiting the island, they were still encountering some of the megafauna. Early Malagasy cultures incorporated these animals into their art, their stories, and their spiritual beliefs. We have a window into what it was like for humans to live alongside these giants, and what it meant when they disappeared. But Madagascar was just one chapter in an ongoing story. Across the Pacific, other islands were experiencing their own versions of the same tragedy, each one a unique variation on the theme of human arrival, followed by rapid extinction. New Zealand offers perhaps the most dramatic example of island megafauna extinction, compressed into an even shorter time frame than Madagascar. When Polynesian settlers arrived around 1280 CE, they found islands dominated by moa, flightless birds that had evolved to fill the ecological niches occupied by large mammals on other continents. There were 9 species of moa, ranging from turkey-sized birds to giants that stood 12 feet tall and weighed over 500 pounds. These weren't just big birds, they were ecosystem engineers. The largest moa species were browsers, using their height to reach foliage that no other animals could access. Their feeding patterns shaped the structure of New Zealand's forests, creating the open understories that countless smaller species depended on. Like the elephant birds of Madagascar, moa had evolved without mammalian predators. The only large predator in their world was Haast's eagle, a massive raptor with a 10-foot wingspan that specialised in hunting the largest moa. This eagle-moa dynamic had been stable for millions of years, with the eagles controlling moa populations and the moa maintaining forest structure through their browsing. When humans arrived, this ancient balance collapsed within decades. The Maori, like other Polynesian peoples, were skilled hunters with sophisticated technologies. They had dogs, the first mammalian predators New Zealand had seen in millions of years. They had spears, nets, and coordinated hunting strategies, and they encountered birds that had never learned to fear anything that approached from the ground. The archaeological evidence suggests that moa hunting was initially incredibly easy. Early Maori sites are littered with moa bones, often from multiple individuals killed at the same location. Some sites suggest that entire flocks were slaughtered at once, possibly by driving them into natural traps, like coastal cliffs or swampy areas where they couldn't escape. But the ease of hunting may have been the moa's downfall. With such abundant, easily obtained protein available, there was little incentive for restraint. Archaeological sites show evidence of wasteful hunting practices, with many moa carcasses only partially processed, suggesting that more birds were being killed than could be consumed. The impact cascaded through New Zealand's ecosystems with breathtaking speed. As moa populations declined, Haast's eagles lost their primary prey base. These massive raptors, perfectly adapted for hunting large flightless birds, couldn't survive on the smaller prey that remained. Within 200 years of human arrival, both the moa and Haast's eagles were extinct. The loss of the moa had profound effects on New Zealand's forests. Without large browsers to control vegetation, forest understories became dense and impenetrable. Plant communities that had been shaped by millions of years of moa browsing began to change dramatically. Seeds that had once been dispersed by these giant birds accumulated beneath parent trees, unable to colonize new areas. The speed of these extinctions is almost incomprehensible. Moa had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic climate shifts over millions of years. They had successfully colonised both of New Zealand's main islands and adapted to environments ranging from coastal forests to alpine grasslands. And then, in less than 3 centuries, they were gone forever. But New Zealand's extinctions extended far beyond the Moa. The islands were home to a unique assemblage of flightless birds, giant insects, and endemic mammals found nowhere else on Earth. Adze bills, flightless rails the size of small ostriches, disappeared shortly after human arrival. Giant geese, flightless ducks, and numerous species of flightless wrens all vanished from the fossil record at the same time as the Moa. The pattern was so consistent that paleontologists can use it as a dating tool. If you find the bones of extinct New Zealand birds in an archaeological site, you know that site dates to within a few centuries of initial human colonisation. The timing is that precise. What makes these Pacific Island extinctions particularly tragic is that they were entirely preventable. The human populations that caused them were small, numbering in the thousands rather than millions. The islands were large enough to support both humans and their native fauna indefinitely. But the hunting technologies were so effective and the prey so vulnerable that coexistence was never really possible. Recent studies have attempted to model what might have happened if early Pacific Islanders had practiced conservation measures. Even relatively simple restrictions, like seasonal hunting bans or taboos on killing breeding females, might have prevented many extinctions. But such measures would have required a level of ecological understanding that these early colonists couldn't have possessed. They were encountering completely novel ecosystems, filled with animals they'd never seen before. They had no way of knowing that these birds were endemic to their new homes, that they existed nowhere else on Earth, or that once extinct, they could never be replaced. From their perspective, they were simply exploiting abundant resources in their new environment. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that these extinctions eliminated not just species, but entire evolutionary experiments. The Moa represented a unique solution to the challenge of being a large herbivore on islands without large mammals. Haast's eagle was one of the largest raptors ever to evolve, perfectly adapted for hunting giant flightless birds. When these animals disappeared, millions of years of evolutionary innovation vanished with them. The Pacific Island extinctions also demonstrate how quickly human impact can cascade through ecosystems. On islands like New Zealand and Madagascar, the loss of a few key species triggered ecological collapses that affected countless other plants and animals. Food webs that had been stable for millions of years unravelled in decades. But perhaps the most sobering lesson from these island extinctions is how they preview what's happening in the world today. Islands are natural laboratories for understanding extinction processes because they're isolated, relatively simple systems where cause and effect relationships are easier to trace. What happened on Madagascar, New Zealand, and countless other islands when humans first arrived is now happening on a global scale. The difference is that today's extinctions are happening in a world where we understand the consequences of our actions. We know that large animals are vulnerable to human impact. We know that once species are extinct, they're gone forever. We know that ecosystem collapse can happen with frightening speed. And yet, the pattern continues, playing out in slow motion across Africa, Asia, and South America, as the last of the world's megafauna face mounting pressure from human activities. The giants are still disappearing. The only question is whether we've learned enough from the ghosts of Madagascar and New Zealand to prevent the same fate from befalling the elephants, rhinos, and great apes that remain. The archaeological record suggests that this pattern of human arrival, followed by megafauna extinction, is as old as our species itself. But for the first time in our history, we have the knowledge and the technology to break that pattern if we choose to use them. The question is whether we will. The story doesn't end with islands, though. It continues today, right now, as you listen to this, because the pattern we've traced through deep time, from the Ice Age caves of Europe to the remote islands of the Pacific, is still unfolding. The difference is that now we're watching it happen in real time, and we understand what we're seeing. Walk through any natural history museum and you'll find yourself surrounded by ghosts. The mounted skeletons of mammoths and saber-toothed cats, the reconstructed models of moa and elephant birds, the dioramas showing landscapes filled with creatures that no longer exist. These displays are beautiful, educational, inspiring even, but they're also monuments to loss, testaments to a world we'll never see again. What's harder to grasp is that future visitors to these same museums might be looking at skeletons of animals that are alive today. The rhinoceros, the elephant, the tiger, the great apes. These creatures, the last remnants of the megafauna that once dominated our planet, are facing the same pressures that eliminated their prehistoric cousins. The parallels are unsettling. Today's remaining megafauna are experiencing habitat loss, hunting pressure, competition for resources, and climate change. Sound familiar? These are the same factors that drove mammoth and ground sloths to extinction thousands of years ago. The only difference is the scale and speed. Modern humans don't hunt elephants with stone-tipped spears, but we've developed far more efficient methods of elimination. Habitat destruction, through agriculture and development, can remove entire populations without firing a single shot. Chemical pollution can sterilize ecosystems across vast areas. Climate change driven by industrial activity is reshaping environments faster than most large animals can adapt, and just like our ancestors, we're doing it unintentionally. The farmers clearing forests in Sumatra aren't trying to eliminate orangutans, they're trying to feed their families. The ranchers converting grasslands in Africa aren't attempting to eradicate elephants, they're trying to make a living. The consumers buying products made from endangered species often don't even know what they're contributing to. But the result is the same. Large animals disappearing from landscapes where they've lived for millions of years, ecosystems losing their keystone species and beginning to unravel. The same tragic story playing out again, just with different actors and different technologies. Consider what's happening in Africa right now. 50 years ago, the continent was home to over 1 million elephants. Today, fewer than 400,000 remain. In some regions where elephants were once abundant, they've disappeared entirely. The silence in these places is profound, the kind of emptiness that takes generations to fill. Rhinos tell an even starker story. The northern white rhinoceros is functionally extinct, with only 2 females remaining and no viable breeding males. The Javan rhinoceros clings to existence with fewer than 70 individuals left in the wild. These are species that survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic climate shifts over millions of years. But they couldn't survive the past century of human pressure. The great apes face similar challenges. Orangutans in Southeast Asia have lost over 80% of their habitat in the past few decades. Mountain gorillas exist in populations so small that a single disease outbreak could eliminate entire subspecies. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have disappeared from vast areas of their former range. What makes this modern extinction crisis particularly tragic is that we know it's happening. Unlike our ancestors who encountered naive prey animals on new continents, we have detailed scientific understanding of these species' biology, ecology, and conservation needs. We know what it would take to save them. We have the technology and resources to protect them. And yet, the extinctions continue. This raises uncomfortable questions about human nature. Are we fundamentally a species that eliminates large animals wherever we go? Is there something about our psychology or our social organisation that makes coexistence with megafauna impossible in the long term? The archaeological record suggests that this pattern is deeply ingrained, playing out consistently across different cultures, time periods, and environments. But there's another way to look at it. the same intelligence that made us such efficient eliminators of Ice Age megafauna also gives us the capacity to understand and prevent modern extinctions. We've learned to recognize the warning signs, to predict which species are most vulnerable, and to implement conservation strategies that can work when properly funded and enforced. Some success stories offer hope. The California condor was down to just 27 individuals in 1987, but intensive conservation efforts have brought the population back to over 500 birds. Humpback whales were nearly extinct due to commercial whaling, but international protection has allowed many populations to recover dramatically. The southern white rhinoceros was reduced to fewer than 50 individuals at the beginning of the 20th century, but careful management has increased the population to over 18,000 today. These recoveries required massive investments of time, money and effort. They demanded international cooperation, scientific expertise, and long-term commitment from governments and conservation organisations. But they prove that the pattern can be broken, that large animals can coexist with human societies when we make the conscious choice to protect them. The question is whether we'll make that choice consistently enough to save the remaining giants, because this isn't just about individual species anymore. We're facing the potential collapse of entire ecosystems that depend on large animals for their structure and function. Elephants, for instance, are ecosystem engineers. On a massive scale, they create and maintain the water holes that countless other species depend on during dry seasons. Their feeding habits shape plant communities across vast areas of savanna and forest. Their movements create pathways that other animals use for migration. When elephants disappear from an ecosystem, the effects cascade through every level of the food web. The same is true for other remaining megafauna. Rhinos are crucial grazers that maintain grassland habitats. Large predators like tigers control prey populations and prevent overgrazing. Great apes disperse seeds through forests and help maintain plant diversity. These animals aren't just beautiful or charismatic, they're functionally essential to the ecosystems they inhabit. Losing them would mean losing not just individual species, but entire ways of life that have existed for millions of years. Forests that have been shaped by elephant browsing for millennia. Grasslands maintained by rhinoceros grazing since the Pleistocene. Predator-prey relationships that have been stable since long before humans evolved. We're living through what some scientists call the sixth mass extinction, a period of species loss comparable to the great extinction events that eliminated the dinosaurs and reshaped life on Earth. But this one is different because we're causing it, and we're aware of what we're doing. The fossil record shows that life recovers from mass extinctions eventually. New species evolve to fill empty ecological niches. Ecosystems reorganize and stabilize in new configurations. But this process takes millions of years, and there's no guarantee that the resulting world will be one that humans can thrive in. More immediately, the loss of megafauna impoverishes our world in ways that extend far beyond biology. These animals have been part of human consciousness for as long as our species has existed. They appear in our earliest art, our oldest stories, our deepest mythologies. A world without elephants, without tigers, without great apes would be a world that's fundamentally different from any that humans have ever known. Children growing up in such a world would have no direct experience of truly wild animals. Their understanding of nature would be limited to small creatures and domestic species. The sense of wonder and humility that comes from encountering something truly magnificent in the wild would become increasingly rare. But perhaps more importantly, losing the last megafauna would mean accepting that the pattern we've traced through this story is inevitable, that humans are fundamentally incompatible with large wild animals, that our presence in any ecosystem ultimately means the elimination of its giants. That's a conclusion I'm not ready to accept, because buried in the archaeological record Alongside all the evidence of extinction and ecological collapse, there are also hints of a different relationship. Cave paintings that suggest reverence rather than just exploitation. Burial sites where humans and animals were interred together. Oral traditions that speak of kinship across species boundaries. These glimpses suggest that the relationship between humans and megafauna doesn't have to be one of elimination. That coexistence is possible when it's approached with wisdom, respect, and long-term thinking, but it requires us to make conscious choices that our ancestors, lacking our scientific understanding, couldn't make. The story we've told tonight is ultimately about choices. The choice to hunt sustainably or to overkill. The choice to share landscapes or to claim them exclusively. The choice to see other species as resources to be exploited or as partners in the ongoing experiment of life on Earth. Our ancestors made their choices largely in ignorance, without understanding the long-term consequences of their actions. We don't have that excuse. We know what happens when human pressure exceeds the capacity of large animals to adapt. We know how quickly ecological systems can collapse. We know that extinction is forever. The question is what we'll choose to do with that knowledge. So here we are, fellow sapiens, at the end of a story that doesn't really have an ending, because while the mammoths and giant ground sloths are gone forever, their ghosts still walk among us in the form of elephants and rhinos, and great apes clinging to existence in an increasingly crowded world. The pattern we've traced tonight, from the Ice Age steppes to the remote islands of the Pacific, reveals something uncomfortable about our species. We are, it seems, extraordinarily good at making large animals disappear. Not through malice, not through grand design, but through the simple act of being human in spaces where giants live. But here's what gives me hope in this story of loss. For the first time in our 300,000-year history, we understand what we're doing. We can see the pattern, trace the consequences, predict the outcomes. And with that knowledge comes the possibility, however fragile, of choice. The megafauna extinction isn't ancient history. It's happening right now, as you listen to these words. But unlike our ancestors who stumbled unknowingly through ecological collapse, we have the tools to recognize when we're standing at the edge of another great silence. The question is whether we'll use them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through deep time. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about our place in the natural world, let me know in the comments. Share it with others who might need to hear it. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that make us uncomfortable. Until next time, fellow sapiens, stay curious about the world we've inherited and thoughtful about the one we're leaving behind.